Many thanks, Anna, for and colleagues of the Ecologic Institute for actually organizing this webinar and inviting me. And yeah, I'm really curious actually to hear also from you later after I gave a little bit of input, because as Anna said, the voices of Central and Eastern Europe, they're often not as loudly heard. So that's why I'm also having a very personal interest in the discussion later. But I would like to start with actually a kind of like broader introduction to, why we actually should care really about the consumption side as well as to the production side. So the longer title now is like how healthy diets can support sustainability targets and what role national and regional food strategies can play. We obviously will also hear later a little bit on the EU dimension and in a particular experience for local food strategies. So I really try to set the context. Yes, and as Anna already introduced, I work for a think tank, Agri-Culture. We're funded by foundations, among them also the Robert Bosch Foundation. So that's great. And we really, just to give you a context, really care about the whole land use sector up to food, in terms of how do we transform the agri-food system actually, and really work on this interface between science, policy, and society and the private sector. So that's what we do and develop policy options. So that's a little bit from what I would like to tend to do in the next 20 minutes, then leaving also 10 minutes for questions and Q&A, and about my background. So the just next slide, wait a sec. So the kind of three things that the three clusters I would like to see is why actually food and diets are key to achieve health and sustainability objective. That's try to keep it rather short, because some of that, particularly for the environmental part, you obviously mostly know that, but also really looking also at the health side and also at the social side that Anna already touched upon as well. And then, say why we need to act, and if we want to act, how does it look like then? What it does, that food system approach, that integrated food policies, how does it look like, and what are actually kind of first steps and important principles that we should consider. So for the first part, really zooming in, is why food and diets are key to achieve health and sustainability objectives. I think that is something you often touch upon. I mean, we are all here, and the whole webinar series is very much about the whole question of climate change and agriculture, but really looking for the consumption side some more in a moment. But really we have globally this rough third of greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. Biodiversity loss is largely due to agriculture. The whole question of land degradation and freshwater use, that's pretty clear. And I would like to zoom in now a little bit for the EU and for really the demand side. And that's numbers that are not as often heard. So actually another intention for these 20 minutes inputs is also to kind of reflect on some myth that we often see, or misperceptions around the role of food. And I mean, I think what we all see is when we talk about climate change, a lot of attention is made to the transport sector, to the housing sector. And if we really look at the consumption footprint of EU citizens, it is really an impressive number, and that's a commission number by the GSC, of 38% of greenhouse gas emissions are actually due to a food footprint, right? So followed then by housing and transport. So that's important to know. And the other important part is, and I followed this, what comes to your mind when you talk about sustainable food, is that a lot of attention is to the question of local and regional, and people often also perceive that if my food is local, that is a big impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, I mean, I'm now playing both sides. This is not the case. There are many good reasons for local supply chains to say that. We'll come to that later. but it's not because of the greenhouse gas emissions. That's very important. So the production side, the land use change side, that's an important one. And then if we dive in deeper, so like, you know, production, what is that? It's really the question of like what we eat rather than where it is from. And these again now like global numbers, because we don't have that on a EU level. It's really like showing like what are the products with the biggest greenhouse gas emission footprint. And this is clearly animal products, meat, but also dairy and eggs. That's important to know. And we also see here, like, you know, you see the green and the brown bars that are the biggest one that are actually land use change and the greenhouse gas emissions emitted at farm level. And then you see this tiny, try to find it like turkeys. That's the transport one, just like to put it into context, right? So that is important. This particular graph here is like per kilogram of food, but they look very similar if you do the same exercise for calories and proteins. So important take-home message is it's really important what we eat, and animal products do play a particular role. Speaking of animal products that do play a particular role, I would also like to highlight among the many environmental impacts the often kind of sidelined question of biodiversity loss that is taking place at much higher speed than we've seen like before humans actually showed up on this planet. Actually, we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction in terms of biodiversity loss. The last one was a tiny amount of 65 million years ago and led to the extinction of dinosaurs, etc. So it is really a huge crisis, just at the same size of the climate crisis. So that's important to know. And again, food plays a huge role. And here again, you see like 3/4 of the biodiversity impact. This case here, it's German numbers, because it's always tricky to find numbers at all. So, you know, take the few studies that we have, and that's a really very relevant and recent one from Germany that showed like, 75% of biodiversity loss, relates back to the animal products in our food consumption. So you see, what I will highlight very often is like the question of what we eat, role of animal products. But of course, there are many other issues. I could have taken a messy IPCC slide here. I took another one from a science publication to show that it's really, if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, it's mainly two things that really, really matter. And that's the question of like plant-rich diets. But it's similarly also the question of food waste reduction, particularly if these two are combined. So for greenhouse gas emissions, these are relevant. So please, we should keep them in mind as key factors. I would also like to show or to dive a little bit deeper to what Anna already mentioned in terms of like the health impacts that we see due to food consumption. I mean, of course, I could talk for longer here, but I want to highlight some particular issues, and that is that we see 80% of the total burden of disease is actually related to unhealthy diets in Europe, and that they are actually the leading risk factor for communicable diseases like type 2 diabetes, different types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, etc. So that is important to note. Of course, here we also talk a lot, mainly about like too much sugar, too much fat, too much salt, overconsumption, right? So, and too little of like vegetables, etc. But then it's a broader picture, of course, if we have a consideration from the health aspect. We also need to speak of like, because we often speak like, how do we actually finance this transformation? And I really want to point out, this money is already in the system. It's unfortunately in the health costs of the system, and of course the environmental costs as well, but it's actually staggering numbers. It's like 102 billion a year for the EU economy, like just can be attributed to dietary risk. So that's a large number. Actually, last week, the FAO came out with the State of Food and Agriculture report. They also had a look at the hidden costs in the food system, so really a true cost accounting approach, and they came up with like 10 trillion, yeah, okay, so the zeros would fill the slide here, per year in terms of hidden cost, and 70% 70% are already in the health sector. So that's actually a huge thing, why we also need to think together like health and environment. Another important point, if we talk about health, and I'm saying that because like food policy is often perceived as something private, something individual. Same is for health. And it's not the case. If we talk about health, there is a concept that is longer around in the health community, which is called the One Health approach. It can also be called like planetary health. That actually reflects that if we talk about health, we really talk about interconnected systems. We are very much connected to our healthy environments and actually also the health of animals. To showcase two examples is, of course, the whole question of antimicrobial resistance. So actually the antibiotics we feed to animals have an impact actually about the antimicrobial resistance also affecting humans. But it's also, for example, the risk for zoonotic diseases. We all know the corona pandemic, and that was a zoonotic disease. And it's really interesting to show like 3 years ago, we had a UNEP report saying like, what are the key risk factors for the next pandemic? And guess what was on place one? It was like an increased demand for animal proteins. So they're really, really closely linked. And I would just want to highlight that it's not just about nutrients for humans, it's really the interconnection to animal health and the health of the environment. And the last point here I want to make is the whole, link to social questions. And I really want to highlight that we are in a historically weird situation that we see a socioeconomic gradient that the lowest income groups are more likely to be obese compared to those in the highest income segment. So the burden is really on the socioeconomic weak people. That has a lot to do with the food environments I come to speak about later. And we also have a lot of people cannot afford regular nutritious meals a day. That's also something that's not often on the agenda. We're talking about like 36 million people in the EU, or put it to 8%. So that's important. So that's the kind of dimensions we need to keep in mind if we speak about like sustainable diets. How does that look like? And I've seen like in the kind of little overview what comes to your mind. There was also planetary health diet. For those of you who don't know it, and it's a concept that became quite popular, developed 4 years ago by the E-Lancet Commission, and actually try to combine the question like, how does a diet, average diet, right? This is not a dietary recommendation, right? But how does it look like if we want to feed a global population of 10 billion people by 2050 within the planetary boundaries and want to provide a healthy diet. And this is how this average looks like. And you see animal products obviously still play a role. And it's really important to say that we're not talking about like vegetarian, vegan, or, status quo. It's animal products have the role to play. It's just much less. And we will talk about a lot about like, less but better in terms of like environmental impacts, but also in terms of like animal welfare. So that's approximately like, 3/4 reduced to the status quo, to just give you a dimension for the particular aspect of animal products. And of course, it's much more about more fruits, more vegetables, more legumes, and more nuts. So that's what it is about. So that was the kind of like, why should we care? And hopefully it came out like, wow, okay, it's convincing. It's an important area. And it does have an impact on the broader society, not just on individual health, right? So that's important. So the question now is like, how can we actually address these consumption patterns? Like, it's not about like, forbidding anything. It's like, how can we support this process, or like how Anna said, like, relearn how to eat well. What role can also like policymakers play? And there are two particular things I want to highlight here in terms of like the kind of paradigm shifts we need. And the one is, we really need to think in food environments. We often think about like, we need to inform consumers more. Consumers are responsible for better diets. And it's really like kind of changing that paradigm to people are influenced by the food environments they are around them. It's actually a well-established concept. Meanwhile, we also recently seen the two reports by Sam and Sapea, like the scientific councils of the European Union, really pointing out that concept. And we are currently in the situation, I mean, you probably know that, I mean, people are influenced by their surrounding, you depending on like what's available in the supermarket, like the behavior of family members, even like what you see in the canteen, the density of fast food outlets if you're on a train station. So you actually know all that, right? It's not just like your knowledge, your motivation, it's really like the environment around you. And currently, it's actually the prevailing food environments make it difficult for people to adopt a healthy and sustainable diets due to portion size, due to marketing, due to actual availability. And so this graph on the left really shows you, like, I mean, the inner circle shows you like the influences on individual behavior, and you recognize obviously the stuff that's often talked about, the motivation, if you want to follow a certain diet. But of course, this is also about routines that really shape a lot our activities and behavior, your preferences. It's of course also about capabilities. It really is about how good are my cooking skills, my storage for skills in terms of like avoiding food waste, is my knowledge about healthy and sustainable diets. But then the often forgotten part is the one in the middle, like the opportunities, right? I mean, do I have enough income? Does my family life allow me enough time to actually prepare this stuff? What are the social norms around me actually? Is that really like, against the tide, or is that an easy thing to do? So that's important. So that's shaping like individual behavior. And then we have like the circle, the food environment around that. And that's like actually what is available in food service, in retail. How is the food composed in terms of like recipes for processed products? How is access and affordability? So, in terms of like what are the social and fiscal policies? How are the tax policies? What's expensive, what not? But also the whole question of like appeal and information, like what's the marketing? Is it recognizable in terms of label? What's good, what's not? How's the education and the social environment? So really important. So like actually, if you want to, cut that into like one sentence, like make the good choice the easy choice, right? So this is why we need to care about food environments, and these food environments can actually also be shaped by policymakers, and I come to that later. The second aspect is we really need to understand food as a cross-cutting policy area. I would like to start saying, like, I mean, food policy is not new, you might say, like, why am I making this big case? We have different starting points. I mean, a very prominent one is food safety, right? I mean, we have actually a pretty good food safety system established in the EU, in member states. So that is there. And we also often see, like, health policies dealing with food in particular, let's say dietary guidelines, food-based dietary guidelines. But there are so many more, and the environmental approaches usually have not really had a look at food. You could say like cultural, you could say consumer protection. It's all about waste management, it's education, it's research, it's the public participation. There are a lot of issues where food plays a role. But we see these sectoral approaches, and they are predominant and pretty much on all levels. Isabel will probably talk about that later for the EU level, and we'll see what Charlotte says about the Lower Saxony strategy. But this is what we see. So we really need to actually align them. We need to collaborate. And if you do that, you can see quite a lot of synergies. And this is actually also the opportunity to deal with the trade-offs, right? I mean, there are conflicts that need to be solved, right? And just like to point out some examples, like if we have a good like food education, and then in school you go to the canteen and it's simply not a good offer, and you have 15 minutes to eat in a not convincing environment. Like, we also need to then implement it in practice if we manage to do it well in education. Or like, of course, a prominent one is like, if we support plant-based diet, what happens to livestock farmers? Like, can we also put them on a transition pathway to diversify their economic business models, etc.? How does it look like? Provide also like planning security, right? It's just like not look at this one part and ignore the other one, but think it together, right? And this particular graph is actually just like highlighting a couple of areas on the local level. Really, there also is a very fantastic place to deal with food policy, because a lot of the competences are on the local level. Others are national, others are on EU, and it's really about like this also like kind of vertical integration of food policy areas. Turning to the last part. So, and I rather stay vague at this part, just giving a clue like what's important here. And the one thing is, what are the kind of key things if you want to get started, right? One thing that you might see like listening to me or others is like, oh my God, it's so complex, I don't even want to start. And it's really like, there's not one size fits all. It's really like looking like, where are the particular problems in your country, in your region? Is it an issue of like food insecurity that gives the start? Or is it a question of food waste reduction that is a start? Is it a turn towards plant-based diets, whatever? Every anchor is welcome, right? And see where you can get from there to then invite start a strategic process and invite the other stakeholders. It's really important to have them early in the process. It's actually also to get the perspectives in. It's not necessary to get the economic interest in, and that's a tricky balance you need to see, right? You need whatever, have the retail perspective, have the economic perspective for the farmer side, right? You just need to make sure like, how that it doesn't overlap too much with the economic interests behind that. Have a good facilitation of the process. So that's really crucial. I could speak about that for ages, but I don't. I just want to like highlight some points that are easily overlooked. Easily overlooked is often also like to really start with action plans, start with lighthouse projects that also like give you the feedback, then it works, we can do more, and just really dare to start with one thing. Also put the funding behind it, just like for the public authorities in the audience. And also super important and often forgotten is this kind of integrated food policy is a new policy area. So we know very little yet about the impacts of the interventions. So it's really important to set up an evaluation early on, and then have this constant learning. So this is why I put this food policy cycle on here, and like, learn from what worked and what didn't work and adapt accordingly. The second of the three issues, like in terms of like what to keep in mind if you want to start, is like, don't reinvent the wheel. And this is a problem because we unfortunately have very little platforms so far. And I think we need one on the EU level where we can exchange actually about like successful examples of food policies. I just want to highlight, if you want to dive in later, a fantastic example of how a process in setting up a strategy should look like can be found in the UK and England. Done in 21. Actually, it was an independent review for the government. Unfortunately, the government didn't take up everything that was developed in that fantastic strategy, but it's really a fantastic, easy read, very well done. Have a look at Denmark. Like 3 weeks ago, they came up with a strategic plan to support plant-based diet and included the question of supporting organic production as well, which is not seen very often before. So really cool here also in terms of alliance building. Or if you look for like a good like local policy approach, is like Ghent is around since ages and has collected so many great examples, just like, some snapshots, because it's always good to know you're not the first. And the last one I just want to highlight is like, because I made the case of like, start with like lighthouses, what are good areas to start activities with? And it is public procurement. And it is the case for many reasons, because in public procurement, we see that we have the opportunity really to shape the sector. And that means the agricultural sector, because like this buying power of the public authorities to buy the sustainable, healthy, local, seasonal, whatever food. So it really can shape something. And at the same time, it also shapes consumption patterns and preferences and social norms. And so that is really a fantastic tool. And if you do that, it, of course, even here, it requires a mix of instruments. It's, set appropriate sustainability procurement criteria. It's also very often that you need training, funding programs, etc., training for the food service teams, like the chefs and the people in the kitchen, to get things done. And then it's also, again, here, like to test some, behavior change interventions. And I just kind of want to close, because that is already my pretty much last slide, to make it a little bit more tangible. And again, here, there's also a little bit of a myth we often see. It's like, if we want to support plant-based diets, then we probably, just work a lot with we have vegan dishes and etc. And I just want to make that very particular point of why language matters. And I would like to take a study that was done in 2020 by the World Resource Institute, and it will be updated very soon, that actually had a look first in literature, like what are good behavior change interventions. And you really need to look into literature, what works and what doesn't. And they collected this broad range of possible interventions, 57. And then they did a ranking together with practice people, what's feasible, because that's important as well, right? And what has a high impact. So you see that that the both axes. So on the y-axis you have the feasibility, and you have the impact on the x-axis, and then you have all these different instruments. And I just picked out those that are super feasible and have a great impact, and they're both related to language, right? So if you think you have go in a restaurant, then you see this dish, and then you have vegetarian. Don't. Okay, so mix them, have a little bit of a whatever, a V or a plant or whatever, like a logo that, people who really care about vegetarian, vegan will find their way. But if you throw it to them, this is the vegetarian, menu, you won't reach the broader crowd, right? Just make it very attractive. And that's actually the second point, make it really attractive, right? Emphasize the positive attributes. And they even made it a kind of do and don't list. And it's quite surprising, I would say, but at the don't use, it is, don't use meat-free, don't use vegan, don't use vegetarian, don't use healthy restrictive, low in carb whatever, everything that is low in calories, etc. So don't use this kind of language, but rather do emphasize provenance, where is it from, the kind of stories behind them, the flavor, the look and feel that you have. So that's really important. And I'm just highlighting that because you often end up with think what is right, and then you do it wrong, unfortunately, because you haven't kind of checked back what's the inside of behavior science. So that was it. Just try to summarize that in a concluding slide. As I said, it is the simple answers are unfortunately often wrong. It's a little bit more tricky to think in a complex way, but it's really a way worth going. You've seen that food consumption patterns are key to achieve health and sustainability targets. It's we need to think more in an integrative way, and integrating sectoral policy much better. And it really needs this paradigm shift to food environments, and public procurement is a great way to start in terms of policy actions.